The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the show. I am ready today. I actually showered this morning. I never take showers in the morning, but because I was up early, I figured let's do an even better show today. I will take a shower in the morning. My hair is groomed. I'm ready to go. And we're going to start by talking about climate change. You probably have heard this phrase that's thrown around. 97-3, the scientific consensus is that climate change is real, or that humans are causing or affecting climate change. It's always a little bit vaguely defined in colloquial speech. When people mention that, it's not clear whether we mean 3% of climate scientists deny climate change, or 3% of climate scientists deny that climate change is caused by humans, or that it's 3% of papers, but some other percentage of the scientists. So 3%, first of all, refers to papers, not scientists. And often the anti-science right will point to that 3% and say, look, there have been minority opinions in the past that have ultimately been vindicated. Heliocentrism, right? The sun at the center of our solar system, for example. And of course, it's pretty bogus. The reality is that most scientists agreed with heliocentrism, to take it as an example, but organized religion was significantly opposed to the theory. At a general level, this also ignores that science today functions much differently than it did in the past, but let's forget that for now, right? We've got this infrastructure of what's called peer-reviewed scientific papers. And a peer-reviewed study was done of those 3% of papers that cast doubt on the consensus of climate change. And this is a study called Learning from Mistakes in Climate Research. It was published actually about 10 months ago in the journal called Theoretical and Applied Climatology. And they found major problems with that 3% of all studies into climate change. This sort of meta-study or attempt to verify other studies, they tried to replicate those 3% of studies, and they figured out that a lot of those studies flat out had methodological flaws. In other words, the way that a lot of those studies that cast doubt onto climate change were done did not meet the scientific rigor and standards that one would want. Many of the papers that deny climate change, as a result of the systemic flaws in how the papers were done, have results that actually point to artifacts in the data as a result of how the experiments were set up, rather than any actual counter argument to climate change and climate change being caused by human activity on Earth. And a lot of times they also identify false dichotomies or bad statistical methods. Basically, it's a total indictment that the 3% might be right. It appears that the 3% that cast doubt onto climate change are doing really, really bad science.
And it seems quite nefarious, too, when you take a look at it, because these studies had three major flaws. One was that they would cherry pick information.
Right.
Another was that they used inappropriate curve fitting. And they also just ignored physical realities. So
Sure.
it sounds as if they're starting with their conclusion and trying to work backwards rather than using the scientific method, which is the other way around.
And this is not a huge shock, right? A good question to be asking would be, how is this stuff even getting published in peer-reviewed journals in the first place? And that's actually a major topic in the scientific world right now. And the explanation is mostly what we would expect. You've got a lot of low-quality journals that have a very low standard for what they'll publish. You have people, in some cases, that are using personal connections and cronyism to get their research published. And then you also have some errors from the peer reviewers. And the reason that this should worry all of us is that the peer review method is supposed to be the gold standard of solid science, right? We have many, many papers on the subject of climate change that just have glaring errors in the way the studies were done. And you would hope that the peer review system would catch that, but it didn't in a lot of these cases. And I want to be totally transparent with you. There's probably many studies in the 97% consensus on climate change that also have some methodological problems or might not be replicable. That's just a reality. What should really anger us about all of this is that we've got a crisis in our environment here on Earth. And rather than devoting all of our energy and resources to solving the problem, we have to spend at least some time debunking bad science and trying to explain why the climate skeptics are wrong. And beyond that, even if climate change is a myth, can't we all agree that there are many other good reasons to stop pumping tons of pollution into the air, including disease related to pollution, how it affects animals and thus our food supply, on and so forth? Why is it that we should just ignore everything we're doing to our planet if you can't definitively connect human activities to climate change, which, by the way, you can?
Well, it just sounds like you might have ulterior motives then, because I don't think there's some international conspiracy of 97% of scientists who just think that it's all, made up to get grant money or something like this.
Yeah, right. What would be the incentive to concoct this conspiracy theory? Of course, Alex Jones has some ideas. I won't even repeat them now because that's not what this program is about. But why would there be such a conspiracy? Is it to hurt the oil barons? I mean, come on.
It seems like the incentive would be on the other side, so
Absolutely.
You can get a nice cushy job with the oil industry.
And continue making money by pillaging the resources of our planet. Absolutely horrible and really important study. Okay, there's this idea in the background that I've mentioned that more and more of the Christopher Steele Trump blackmail dossier is accurate. And you'll remember that when we initially heard about this Russian blackmail file, as it's been colloquially called, the position from Trump and his associates was the dossier doesn't exist. Well, then we learned that actually the dossier exists, that both Obama and Trump were briefed on the dossier by the American intelligence community, but that the content of the dossier is all fake. And of course, it turns out that actually a lot of the content of the dossier is true. There's a really good document on the Just Security website by John Sipher. Kind of a funny name for someone who writes on a security website whose last name is Sipher.
Oh, like Decipher?
Even though it's spelled differently, Sipher. John Sipher is a former CIA senior intelligence service operative, and he did something really interesting. He went back and reviewed the Russia dossier, not in the context of what we knew when it leaked, but based on what we now know. And you'll remember that at the time that the dossier leaked, defenders of Trump insisted it's unproven, it's speculative, it's unverified, it's rumors, it's gossip, it's fake, it's irresponsible to even discuss it. But over time, over the last several months, we've learned that more and more of the content of the dossier actually is true. And Sipher points out some really important elements that we should keep in mind. Number one, when you produce this type of document within the intelligence community, you're not delivering it to people on the basis that the contents are 100% accurate. You're delivering it on the basis that these are assertions that are out there. These are things that have been alleged. And then you consider each statement. You consider the credibility of the author, in this case, a highly respected former British intelligence operative named Christopher Steele. And over time, we've learned that so much of what's in the dossier is true. Before it was publicly acknowledged, the reports that served as the base information for the dossier alleged that Russia undertook a massive coordinated effort to disrupt the 2016 election to help Donald Trump. That's now the consensus. Very few now deny that. Reports that make up the Steele dossier alleged, with pretty specific facts, issues related to meetings involving Paul Manafort and Trump affiliates with Russia to discuss stolen documents. That turned out to be true. The dossier alleged that Trump had long-standing involvement with Russia, including to explore business deals. That turns out to be true. The reports alleged that Trump campaign associates had repeated contact with senior Russian officials in the year before the election. We now know that to be true. We learned that when Carter Page traveled to Moscow in July of 2016, he met with Igor Sechin. A later Steele report also claimed that he met with other Russian associates, and we've since learned that those assertions are true. The documents referred repeatedly to all the money that Paul Manafort was getting off the books from the Ukrainian president's pro-Russian party, for example. That's absolutely true. The documents allege that there were meetings between Trump's lawyer Michael Cohen and Russians. That was initially categorically denied by Cohen. We've since been able to independently corroborate relationships with Russian and Ukrainian intermediaries and Michael Cohen. And we've learned about Michael Cohen's direct contact with Felix Sater via email to try to do a Trump Tower Moscow. Every day or week, more of the dossier is verified.
That's not to say that the Christopher Steele dossier is free from inaccuracies. There are a few, but it doesn't take away from any of the major points, and it's not like Steele was trying to deceive. Very credible source. And I mean, some of that's just inevitable when you talk about intelligence reporting. You're never going to get it completely accurate.
And for me, the most interesting thing from John Sipher's analysis was anybody who is going to point to any inaccuracy to say the entire thing is unreliable or untrustworthy doesn't understand the point of such a document. It's to report on assertions that have been made, not necessarily having verified every single one. And listen, does Trump have a urine fetish involving Russian prostitutes? Maybe not, although, by the way, John Sipher says it wouldn't be that inconsistent with what we know about Trump's sexual past, including stories he's told on the Howard Stern show. But it doesn't matter. That does not in any way impact the general credibility of the dossier.
Trump also knew that the Obamas slept on that bed once when they visited Russia, so maybe he just wanted to defile the bed and doesn't really have any sexual interest to begin with.
I would not even dare comment on that, but I think anything is on the table as far as that goes. And a really, really interesting read, which we are linking to, John Sipher's explanation or analysis of the Russia dossier, in the description for the YouTube video for this story. Okay, send me your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at @DPacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Frank Trafficant. Frank, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. We do depend on your membership and Patreon donations in order to fund the show. You can sign up for membership, get all the great member benefits, including the bonus show and the commercial-free all-access pass at davidpakman.com/membership. All of those benefits also available now through Patreon at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Russia has TV shows, not a huge shock to anybody. They have a Sunday night panel show called Sunday Evening with Vladimir Solovyov. This past Sunday, Russian politician Vyacheslav Nikonov, who's a member of the Duma, which is the Russian parliamentary body, said pretty casually that Russian intelligence stole the presidency of the United States in 2016. You'd think, wait a second, we would have heard more about that, but most news outlets were doing wall-to-wall coverage of the hurricane. Nikonov's statement was first noticed by Julie Davis. Julie Davis runs a pretty critical of Russia media monitoring site known as Russia Lies. And I could play the clip for you. Most of our audience doesn't speak Russian, and we don't know how aggressive Russian media is with YouTube copyright claims. So we're going to skip the clip, but you can find it if you go looking for it. And someone in Russia saying this is something that should make news, but it didn't in the U.S. It's not proof of anything. Putin and the Kremlin have been pretty much denying these allegations for a long time, but the fact that a Russian politician mentioned so casually, sort of as part of like a broader conversation that's going on, as kind of like an obvious admission, like, well, yeah, you know, Russian intelligence did steal the American presidential election. If their goal was to throw America into chaos, then they're doing a really good job of it. And whether this is something that they would say as a lie in order to cause more chaos, we don't really know. But at this point, Pat, consider the various positions of different parties on Russian meddling in the election. Now, this is a different question than did Trump criminally collude with Russia? That's not the question.
That's stage 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, exactly. The question is Russian meddling in the election. Democrats in Congress say Russia meddled in the election. Many Republicans in Congress concede that Russia meddled in the election. Separate question from whether Trump colluded. The intelligence community is unanimous that Russia meddled in the election. We even have a Russian politician saying Russia meddled in the election. And yet you still have Trump supporters saying, oh, it's fake news.
Well, I think they hear that and just feel like, well, I'm not going to trust some random politicians.
Oh, no.
Or I'm not going to trust the intelligence community because they deceived us when it came to Iraq, or they're notorious for setting up dictatorial regimes in developing countries. So I can understand that to some extent. But then on the other side of the coin, who are you siding with? People like Vladimir Putin, people like Donald Trump, who was so easily convinced by Putin and actually wanted to set up some voting integrity commission, some international commission after they got out of a meeting at the G20.
Look at this other thing over here. Here's a new shiny thing for everybody to focus on. Don't pay attention to all the stuff that's happening. Remember, Russia's #1 objective is weaken the U.S., make the U.S. look more ridiculous and less powerful on the world stage. And I was thinking again about Brave New World versus 1984. Neil Postman once wrote, "What Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Aldous Huxley, author of Brave New World, feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book, for there would be no one who wanted to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much that we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared we would become a trivial culture." This and the Russia stuff and the fake news nonsense from Trump, this is why I believe what we are living through is much more like Brave New World than it is 1984. Hey, here's an update about Florida Republican Attorney General Pam Bondi. Background, August of 2013, Pam Bondi reached out to Donald Trump, wanted support from Trump for her 2014 re-election campaign in Florida. The following month, in September of 2013, Bondi's office of the Attorney General acknowledged they were investigating Trump's now known to be incredibly fraudulent Trump University. Just a few days later, Donald Trump's charitable foundation, which, by the way, is not even allowed legally to donate to political campaigns, cut a check for $25,000 to a group supporting Pam Bondi's re-election campaign. They ultimately ended up paying a fine for that donation. And then, just 3 weeks later, Pam Bondi's Office of the Attorney General, lo and behold, reverses course and says we're actually not going to pursue the fraud allegations against Trump University. In March of 2014, Trump offered Bondi's re-election campaign a really good deal, renting out his Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida. And now, Florida Republican Attorney General Pam Bondi has accepted a position with the Trump administration on a presidential commission. It's the Commission on Combating Drug Addiction and the Opioid Crisis. And the weird thing about this is that the commission's work is almost done. They're actually supposed to be issuing a report about their findings on October 1st. And just a few days ago, Pam Bondi has accepted the role. Really kind of a weird thing because the role ends in a few weeks. But the real issue is this is yet another example of how Trump bragged on stage about knowing how to work the system. He knows how to use it to his advantage. He knows how to buy politicians. It was during one of the Republican primary debates when they went after him for giving money to Hillary Clinton. And he bragged, "I give money to everybody. I know how to get things done in exchange for that money." Bondi dropped the investigation after he donated the money. It should have been a massive scandal. It would have killed many other candidates, but this is Trump, and this was relatively low on the list of endless scandals he had.
And you wonder, why would a charitable organization be donating to a group affiliated with Pam Bondi's campaign? It just doesn't seem to square up. But apparently the Donald Trump people are saying that it was an accident and that $25,000 was meant to go to a Kansas nonprofit.
Oh,
so you know how that sometimes happens.
I've accidentally donated millions to the wrong nonprofit. Yeah, no, I understand how it happens to the best of us. And in the background, what's not being mentioned is that the investigation into Trump University should have continued. Thousands of people were scammed by Trump University. People lost their life savings, moms, veterans, you name it. And Bondi is one of many associates, political associates, including the Texas Attorney General, Greg Abbott, who also gave Trump a slap on the wrist and dropped a state investigation into Trump University. It is sick.
And Pam Bondi later endorsed Trump. She said that they had been friends for years. You can see them in this picture just hanging out at some event. I mean, their ties go back a long time.
Nice little political system we have here. Would be a shame if anything happened to it, for the people in power, that is. Discuss this with us on our Reddit discussion forum at davidpakman.com/REDDIT.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
The issues of voter fraud and voter suppression have a long and tumultuous history in the United States. The controversy has escalated in recent months after Donald Trump and other Republicans have repeatedly made claims that there's rampant, widespread voter fraud in the United States of America. Trump has actually assembled a special election integrity committee led by Vice President Mike Pence and Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach, one of the most vocal Republicans calling for tighter laws to prevent so-called voter fraud. Even though he won the presidency, Trump seems obsessed with the idea that the election was somehow rigged against him. Trump has repeatedly made the claim that 3 to 5 million illegal immigrants voted in the 2016 presidential election, presumably for Hillary Clinton. A couple of weeks after winning the election, he tweeted, "In addition to winning the Electoral College in a landslide, I won the popular vote if you deduct the millions of people who voted illegally." Then in February, White House spokesperson Stephen Miller was interviewed by George Stephanopoulos and had this to say about the issue of voter fraud.
And you have 14% of non-citizens, according to academic research, at a minimum, are registered to vote.
Despite the over-the-top nature of Trump's claims, a Republican claiming that voter fraud harmed them in an election is really nothing new. Before 2016, dozens of states had already passed restrictive voting laws ostensibly aimed at securing so-called electoral integrity. These efforts were almost exclusively spearheaded by Republicans who have long been vocal about the supposed threat that voter fraud poses to our democracy. So what's the truth? Even if Trump is exaggerating, is there still some reason to be concerned about voter fraud affecting our elections? According to every available study on the issue, the idea that voter fraud has any effect on American elections whatsoever appears to be a myth. The scientific consensus on voter fraud is clear as glass. The Brennan Center for Justice at NYU's law school reviewed all relevant literature on the subject and put out a report called Debunking the Voter Fraud Myth in January of this year. The report found that putting rhetoric aside to look at the facts makes clear that fraud by voters at the polls is vanishingly rare and does not happen on a scale even close to that necessary to, quote, rig an election. A comprehensive study published by a Columbia University political science professor found that, number one, voter fraud is extremely rare. Number two, a lack of evidence of voter fraud is not because of a failure to codify it. And number three, most voter fraud allegations turn out to be something other than fraud. There's a 2016 paper from 4 Ivy League professors and a Microsoft researcher which concluded that the upper limit on double voting in the 2012 election was 0.02%. The upper limit. The paper noted that the incident rate was likely much lower, considering that the researchers showed that, quote, many if not all of these apparent double votes could be a result of measurement error. A 2016 analysis from Dartmouth found no evidence of widespread voter fraud of any kind. A 2014 analysis from Harvard found that, quote, the likely percent of non-citizen voters in recent U.S. elections is 0. Richard L. Hazen, a law professor at the University of California, Irvine, and author of The Voting Wars, went back 30 years to try to find a single example where, quote, an election outcome could plausibly have turned on voter impersonation fraud and was unable to find one. In one of the most comprehensive investigations of voter fraud to date, Justin Levitt of Loyola Law School was only able to identify 31 credible allegations of voter impersonation out of more than 1 billion ballots cast between 2000 and 2014. That's roughly 0.000000031% of votes, which would be the result of in-person voter fraud. The figure may actually be even lower, according to Levitt, because he merely counted all credible claims, not prosecutions or convictions. Voter impersonation is just one of several tactics that can theoretically be used to commit voter fraud. Levitt's figure is an important one, though, because the bulk of state laws aimed at preventing voter fraud are voter ID laws, which require registered voters to provide government ID before casting a ballot. Levitt wrote in a 2014 op-ed in the Washington Post that requirements to show ID at the polls are designed for pretty much one thing: people showing up at the polls pretending to be somebody else in order to each cast one incremental fake ballot. This is a very slow, clunky, and difficult way to steal an election, which is why it rarely happens. So essentially, the voter ID laws pushed by Republicans around the country are totally ineffective in stopping voter fraud, and we'll get to that in more detail later on. Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach, the man who's now leading Donald Trump's voter fraud crusade on a national level, became the only Secretary of State in the nation with the power to prosecute voter fraud cases in 2015 after claiming that, quote, there is a significant problem in Kansas and in the rest of the country of aliens getting on our voting rolls. Kobach ultimately failed to prosecute a single case of non-citizens committing voter fraud. Kobach also examined 84 million votes cast in 22 states to look for cases of duplicate registration. That project yielded 14 prosecutions representing 0.00017% of the votes cast. An exhaustive Washington Post investigation found only 4 documented cases of voter fraud during the 2016 election. These included a Trump supporter who tried to vote twice in Iowa, a Trump supporter who tried to vote twice in Texas, supposedly to, quote, test the system, and a woman who tried to cast a ballot for a recently deceased spouse. A woman in Florida was also caught marking empty bubbles on absentee ballots, but there's no evidence she changed a single presidential vote. A 2017 analysis from the Washington Post found that there is, quote, no evidence to support Trump's claims that people from Massachusetts were bussed in to New Hampshire to vote against him and Kelly Ayotte. So where does all this hysteria come from in the first place? What, if any, evidence do these conservatives have to hold up in the face of the mountain of evidence that seems to disprove their claims? Earlier, I showed you a clip of White House spokesperson Stephen Miller, who told George Stephanopoulos that, quote, 14% of non-citizens, according to academic research, at a minimum, are registered to vote. What academic research was Stephen Miller referring to? Turns out that Miller was referring to research by Old Dominion University professors that used data from the 2008 and 2010 elections. Now, the Old Dominion study didn't examine voter rolls or even uncover any direct evidence of any illegal immigrants voting, but instead it relied on voluntary polling data of adult Hispanic Americans. According to the Old Dominion researchers, 14% of the survey's several hundred respondents who identified themselves as non-citizens also said that they're registered to vote. The researchers then extrapolated this finding to suggest that there are potentially, millions of non-citizens lurking in the shadows of our voter rolls, casting ballots that cancel out the franchise of American citizens. Stephen Ansalabahir, a Harvard professor who manages the data used in the Old Dominion study, said that the data was misused and the study's conclusions are wrong. Ansalabahir was adamant, arguing that, quote, their finding is entirely due to measurement error, adding that, quote, the Old Dominion study is an incorrect use of the survey that we manage and a false claim of evidence of non-citizen voting. It's a dangerous, stray, false fact. And Salabahir explained that, quote, we ask people in successive years their citizenship. That minimizes the error. Upon doing so, we find no instances of voting among people stating consistently that they are non-citizens. Even one of the Old Dominion researchers, Jesse Richman, said to the Washington Post that, quote, there has been a tendency to misread our results as proof of massive voter fraud, which we don't think they are. So one of the very researchers who Stephen Miller cited says the data does not mean what Miller claims it means. A similar study conducted by McLaughlin and Associates in 2013 suggested that over 2 million non-citizens may be registered to vote in the U.S. The study has been trotted out by conservative publications like the Washington Times and InfoWars in a desperate attempt to back up Trump and Miller's claims about voter fraud. But the McLaughlin and Associates study relies on the same flawed method as the Old Dominion study, quote, cherry-picking low-frequency events in large sample surveys, as Ansalabahir puts it. And as for Trump's outlandish claim that 3 to 5 million illegal aliens voted in the 2016 presidential election, costing him the popular vote, can you guess where that claim originated? InfoWars. The origin of Trump's wacky claims can be traced back to a Facebook post from Alex Jones that reads, quote, 3 million votes in the U.S. presidential election were cast by illegal aliens, according to Greg Phillips of the votefraud.org organization. As it turns out, however, there is no such report by votefraud.org. It doesn't exist. Greg Phillips, who founded an organization called Vote Stand, said to PolitiFact that he's not even affiliated with votefraud.org. Rather, the claims made by InfoWars correspond back to a series of since-deleted tweets from Phillips's account from just after the November election. On November 11, Phillips tweeted, completed analysis of database of 180 million voter registrations. Number of non-citizen votes exceeds 3 million, consulting legal team. Then on the 13th of November, he followed up with, we have verified more than 3 million votes cast by non-citizens. We are joining True the Vote to initiate legal action. Hashtag unrigged. Phillips, who's a vocal conservative that's worked with the Alabama and Mississippi Republican parties, would not provide any additional information to back up his claims when confronted by PolitiFact. Phillips would also not say what the data is or where it came from or what methodology he used, so we have no idea how Phillips arrived at his conclusion. Phillips's only academic credentials are a BS in business administration from the University of Alabama. So Phillips is no expert in complex data analytics, and he clearly has an agenda to try to show that voter fraud is a major issue. But nonetheless, Phillips and his claims have been taken seriously and have been given a lot of attention by some on the right. Trump himself even cited Phillips in January, tweeting, quote, look forward to seeing final results of Vote Stand. Greg Phillips and crew say at least 3 million votes were illegal. We must do better. In response to questions about the source of Trump's 3 to 5 million illegal votes claim, then Press Secretary Sean Spicer had this to say.
The president does believe that. He has stated that before. I think he stated his concerns of voter fraud and people voting illegally during the campaign. And he continues to maintain that belief based on studies and evidence that people have presented to him.
But exactly what evidence? Speaker Ryan today said there's no evidence. The National Association of Secretaries of State say that they don't agree with the president's assessment. What evidence do you have?
As I said, I think the president has believed that for a while based on studies and information he has.
Presumably the supposed evidence Spicer was referring to is Phillips's November tweets and the corresponding InfoWars story. As long as Phillips refuses to release the data he's referring to and defend its methodology, there is absolutely no reason to consider his claims credible. In all likelihood, Phillips probably used the same flawed, discredited methods that the Old Dominion professors used back in 2014. So again, we're left with absolutely no evidence that non-citizens vote in meaningful numbers in a way that has any impact on our elections. The idea that millions of illegal immigrants vote in U.S. elections makes no intuitive sense either. Wendy Weiser, the director of the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice, and Douglas Keith, who's the Katz Fellow at the Brennan Center, explained in an op-ed for Time that, quote, it is relatively easy for a non-citizen to get caught. If an ineligible person intentionally registers or votes, not only do they risk being recognized, but their name will be on permanent lists of voters for later detection. And as discussed below, lots of people scrutinize those lists looking for potentially legally ineligible voters. They also add that, quote, even more serious, a non-citizen can be deported for casting a single vote they were not eligible to cast. For non-citizens working towards naturalization, merely being registered to vote can serve as a basis for denying citizenship. So again, the idea that millions or even thousands of undocumented people in the U.S. are risking fines, imprisonment, and deportation just to game the system and cast one vote is preposterous. But Republicans play into the idea in an effort to fearmonger to their base and support not only their anti-immigration agenda, but also their politically charged efforts to create tighter voting restrictions. And this is where the really concerning aspect of this whole issue comes into play. The problem is that the whole issue of voter fraud is really a red herring. It's a pretense that Republicans have used for decades to argue for voting restrictions, such as voter ID laws that ultimately serve to disenfranchise significant portions of vulnerable demographics that have been shown to disproportionately vote for Democrats. The Brookings Institution argued in a 2016 report that these voter ID laws systematically disenfranchise minorities, young people, and the poor, adding that they are only one of several practices that add up to a widespread effort at election discrimination. Others include purges of the voting rolls, reductions in early voting opportunities, and the closing of polling stations. Voter ID laws currently exist in 20 states, and the practices of purging voter rolls and limiting early voting and the number of polling stations is widespread throughout the country. In 2016, under the guise of improving election integrity, the Republican-dominated North Carolina legislature enacted a voter ID law that also eliminated same-day voter registration and eliminated 7 days of early voting, as well as putting an end to out-of-precinct voting. It was struck down by a federal court, which found that the law had discriminatory intent and that it targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision. Thousands of pages of documents were released as part of the case, and some showed Republican lawmakers specifically asking for data sorted by race. The judges noted that the data that the North Carolina lawmakers requested before crafting the law showed that African Americans disproportionately lacked the most common kind of photo ID, those issued by the Department of Motor Vehicles. The data also showed that black voters were more likely to make use of early voting, and that counties with Sunday voting in 2014 were disproportionately black and Democratic. After reviewing that data, the legislature passed a bill eliminating early voting. The judges wrote that thus, in what comes as close to a smoking gun as we are likely to see in modern times, the state's very justification for a challenge statute hinges explicitly on race. Specifically, its concern that African Americans, who had overwhelmingly voted for Democrats, had too much access to the franchise. While Governor Pat McCrory insisted that the North Carolina law's only purpose was to combat voter fraud, longtime Republican consultant Carter Wren, who the Washington Post described as a fixture in North Carolina politics, admitted that, of course it's political. Why else would you do it? Look, if African Americans voted overwhelmingly Republican, they would have kept early voting right where it was, Wren said. It wasn't about discriminating against African Americans. They just ended up in the middle of it because they vote for Democrats. These racist voter restriction laws are a completely insidious, cowardly, pathetic, shameful attempt by Republicans to suppress the vote of vulnerable demographics who won't vote for them. Instead of going out and trying to earn people's votes, Republicans are trying to shut them out of the ballot box and rob them of their right to vote. In the context of our country's long and ugly history of barring people of color from the ballot box, the discriminatory aspect of these voter suppression laws is outright shameful. But even still, the targeting of certain demographics has not been exclusively reserved for minorities. Students and poor whites have also become the targets of the Republican crusade to suppress the vote. In leaked emails, Green Bay City Clerk Chris Teske, an appointee of Republican Mayor Jim Schmidt, admitted that the city was trying to hinder college students from voting because they tend to vote Democratic. Leaders of 8 different student groups at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay had asked the city to put an early voting location on campus to alleviate long lines, which prevented many students from voting in the 2016 primaries. The request was denied, and in an email to a colleague colleague on the matter, Teskey, wrote, "I feel by asking for this to be the site for early voting is encouraging the students to vote more than benefiting the city as a whole. I have heard it said that students lean more towards the Democrats." A lawsuit filed in Alabama in 2015 cites the example of a woman from a rural area who can't vote because she lacks a driver's license. According to the lawsuit, she needs to get a state-issued voter ID at the DMV, but the one nearest her is open 1 day per month. There's no public transportation to another DMV 40 miles away round trip with more opening hours. According to a study from NYU's Brennan Center, 11% of voting-age citizens nationally lack necessary photo ID, while many people in rural areas have trouble accessing ID offices. Just think of the burden that these restrictions put on people who lack the time and resources necessary to acquire proper ID, or the countless people who were discouraged from voting because of needlessly long lines caused by local polling stations being closed. While voter fraud is a phantom issue, intentional voter suppression at the hands of Republican state officials is a very real danger for many Americans. And now that Donald Trump is president and Republicans control both houses of Congress, the concern about these voter suppression efforts is only growing. Trump's Election Integrity Commission met for the first time on July 19th, and the commission had previously requested voting data from every state. The kind of data that the commission requested is the same kind of data North Carolina lawmakers used to craft their racist voter suppression legislation. Considering all of the fear-mongering about voter fraud coming from Trump and other top Republicans, many experts are concerned that the commission will use the data to recommend similar measures on the national level. A number of states initially refused the commission's request, including Pennsylvania, whose governor, Tom Wolf, wrote a blistering letter to Kobach in response. Federal courts can still force states like Pennsylvania to comply with the commission's request. Any further voting restrictions that could come out of Trump's crusade could really be devastating. The U.S. already has an abysmal voter turnout rate, and American democracy is already plagued by many shortcomings far more serious than voter fraud. It sometimes feels like some Americans think that the U.S. is the only democratic country in the world, and we regularly pat ourselves on the back for being such a free and fair society. We like to think that America is the shining city on a hill, that we have the best democracy in the world, but the truth is, the Electoral Integrity Project, a nonprofit that monitors elections around the world that is widely considered the most reputable of such organizations, ranks the U.S. 52nd out of 153 countries in the 2016 Perceptions of Electoral Integrity Index, quote, displaying the worst performance among equivalent Western democracies. The EPI cited some of the same voter suppression tactics we've already gone over, as well as the practice of gerrymandering as reasons for America's poor rankings. Moreover, the man who created the criteria that the EPI uses for grading elections, Andrew Reynolds, an expert of international electoral integrity and political science professor at the University of North Carolina, found that North Carolina would not even be classified as a fully functioning democracy if it were its own country. The problem with American democracy is not that we have too many people who are voting who aren't supposed to. It's that we don't have enough participation in our elections, particularly from the segments of society that the Republicans are tactically trying to keep out of the process. Just 55.4% of all eligible voters cast ballots in 2016. Compare that to the turnout in the recent French elections, where nearly 68% of eligible citizens voted, and that was the worst turnout in modern history. The top countries in the world, like Belgium and Sweden, have voter turnouts in the high 80%. So we should be embarrassed by the lack of democratic participation in this country, and we should be doing everything we can to make it easier for people to vote, not harder. The real threat to the integrity of American democracy has nothing to do with so-called illegal aliens or dead people voting, and it has everything to do with conservatives cowardly and in un-American ways trying to disenfranchise the most vulnerable among us.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
This is just the best. I think you're going to like this. Ted Cruz liked a very explicit porn video on Twitter very late last night, a 2-minute porn video from the account Sexual Posts, sexual with 2 L's. The porn video shows a woman walking in on a man and another woman having sex on a couch, was in Ted Cruz's liked Twitter posts for at least 30 minutes before being unliked sometime around 1 a.m., and thanks to this, Ted Cruz was trending globally on Twitter throughout the night. And you will see, what do we have here for people to look at? Yes, Ted Cruz's like of this video. You'll notice that Sexual Posts also updated their Twitter profile to say, follow the same porn as Ted Cruz watches. That is just great. Response from Ted Cruz's communications director, Catherine Frazier. Well, it appears, I guess, that something happened to Ted Cruz's account. She tweeted out, this is amazing. The offensive tweet posted on Ted Cruz's account earlier has been removed by staff and reported to Twitter. What exactly is there to report to Twitter? I mean, the implication must be that someone took control of Ted Cruz's account and did nothing other than like a single porn video. That's what you have to believe. Some hacker took control of a senator's Twitter account, didn't post a political message, didn't change Ted Cruz's profile, didn't do anything other than liking a single porn video very late at night.
I mean, I guess there are a number of explanations to this. Maybe it actually was hacked. Maybe it was some low-level staffer who had access to the account. But it seems like whenever there's these sexual scandals when it comes to politicians, we just give them the pass at first, and then later and later we find out more details and it turns out to be true. Yeah. Like with the Anthony Weiner stuff, at first we thought, well, they're just making fun of his last name. There's no way that's actually a picture of him. Come to find out, it actually was.
Isn't this maybe the most relatable and human action that Ted Cruz has ever taken, though? Like, I can't think of anything Ted Cruz has done that might actually make someone say, oh, you know what? He's just kind of like your average dumb guy who doesn't really know how Twitter works or something.
If there wasn't a layer of hypocrisy here, I wouldn't care. I would just find it pretty funny.
Right. Ted Cruz against porn, against sex shops, supposedly the family values, Christian conservative, publicly recommending pornography on social media to people. At some point, there's always like a conflicting, impossible explanation. So right now, there's an implication that Ted Cruz's account was somehow hacked. Later, we'll hear the responsible intern was fired for this. It's like, well, hold on a second. Was the account hacked, or did an intern just do the wrong thing, thinking maybe they were logged into their own account or something like that?
And if Ted Cruz did do it, did he not know that his likes are public? You know, it's not the same
Probably
as like retweeting or, you know, posting it or something. But
he probably didn't know.
Likes are public too.
Right? I don't know. He probably had no idea that you can see if you like a video, a Twitter post. I do believe, though, that this is a huge step towards bridging the political gap and tensions that we're seeing under the Trump administration, when we can just all laugh at Ted Cruz's technological incompetence. I think it will do a lot to further and support bipartisan actions in our House and Senate. So I think for that, we can all be glad. A voicemail number, 219-2-DAVID-P. This voicemail relates to, I guess, recent comments I made about former Green Party presidential candidate Jill Stein. Let's take a listen.
Hey, David, it's too late. You're going to have to do a whole segment on the Green Party and why you believe Jill Stein is completely incompetent. The internet has spoken.
Right. I've talked about Jill Stein before. Especially now, I don't know that it's really that valuable to spend time talking about why I didn't support Jill Stein. I talked about it during the election. We've heard disagreements from members of our audience with me. We've heard agreements from members of our audience with me. And I just don't know that we're going to learn that much more if I again talk about Jill Stein. And I just don't think she deserves any more attention than the few seconds I gave her up until right now.
Even though the caller is demanding it from that voicemail.
And saying the internet has spoken. I think there is no more Jill Stein talk on the David Pakman Show until the next time I have to remind you that voting for her is a really bad idea.
I'll put that on the list. Subjects not to talk about.
Please add it. Yeah, exactly. Because we're self-censoring here. That's the new one. On the bonus show today, a Pizza Hut in Jacksonville, Florida, told employees fleeing from Hurricane Irma that they might be punished for skipping shifts as a result of the mandatory evacuation. Or wait, mandatory or just recommended evacuation in Jacksonville? I don't remember now. Anyway, we'll talk about it on the bonus show. Also, Fox News' Brian Kilmeade compared monuments to the victims of 9/11 to statues that are statues of Confederate generals from the Civil War. What exactly was in his Frosted Flakes that morning? And lastly, it's not healthy to sit all day. Really, you should be getting up at least once every 30 to 60 minutes, according to different studies. And we will talk about that on the bonus show. We will talk about my standing desk that I have here and all the standing that I do during the day at the David Pakman Show studios. Get instant access to the bonus show. 2 ways. Number 1, membership. davidpakman.com/membership. Instant access to the bonus show. Number 2, Patreon. Patrons at the $5 level at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Also get access. Speak to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.